Oh, it's good to be with you. My name's Simon Smart and you're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. Well, the church has had a, by turns, rocky and rich relationship with the arts. For centuries, the church was a patron of the arts, and some of the greatest works of Western art are full of Christian themes. And at other times, the church, to be honest, has treated artists and their work with suspicion. But how can we think today about the relationship between art and faith? Can art point people to God? Well, Trevor Hart has thought long and hard about this question. He's a pastor and honorary professor at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. He was in Sydney this year to give the 2015 New College Lectures. Here are some highlights of the chat I had with him when he was in town. What is art for? Is it something that's essential to human life, or is it just sort of an add-on like kayaking or whiskey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to think it's essential. That doesn't mean people can't survive without it, but it seems to me to be something that bubbles up sooner or later in human life. And one reason for that, I think, is that art is one way in which, as human beings, we move between the two spheres of our bodies, the material, and the sphere of meaning and value, the significance we find in things. If you think about the way we live as embodied people, we use our bodies to mean more than our bodies ordinarily mean. We do things with our bodies to convey meaning. And in the arts, we take particular material realities, usually, and we form them into a particular form, and they have significance for us. So it's a sort of high point of the general human condition in which we live as embodied creatures, but in a world which is much more than bodily, and in which we find and make significance.
What does theology have to contribute to this discussion around art and the imagination? Some people might think of those two things as being strange companions.
I've always found that odd, actually. If you think about it, how can we actually make sense of claims about things which lie beyond the sphere of our immediate experience? We're driven to use our imagination. I think it's important to distinguish between the imaginative and the purely imaginary. That's a confusion sometimes people make. And so they'll say, if it's just the imagination we're dealing with, does that mean it's not real? Well, no, of course not.
Yes, well, sometimes people talk about an imaginary friend if you're a believer, on the one hand, and yet they might also think of religion as stifling the imagination.
Yeah, on the imaginary friend thing, there's an important difference between having an imaginary friend and a friend who you can only know through acts of imagination. That's an important distinction, I think. Religion as stifling imagination, it can. It shouldn't. Certainly for Christians, it mustn't. Because we're called upon to live lives in a way which is in some sense counter to the run of the way life is often lived. That means using the imagination all the time to envisage what it might mean to take the kingdom of God into the world in new ways. So simply at the level of living the life of faith, imagination is called for. But imagination has always been central too to the ways in which Christians have made sense of the world and understood it in terms of the kingdom of God. And art, of course, has been at the centre of that for many centuries. Until the time of the Reformation, art was one of the most central ways in which Christians did express their faith. And then there was a bit of a hiccup and an interruption, and the Protestant churches in particular had some problems with some of the ways in which art was used, and some of those problems were good concerns. But gradually, I think, the churches are rediscovering the resources available in the arts to express faith and to explore faith.
Yes, there's been a bit of a difficult relationship, hasn't there, between the church and the sort of artistic world. And yet, as you say, lots of people will appreciate some of the great works of art which are thoroughly religious in nature, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. The church was the main patron for the arts in Western societies for the best part of a millennium and a half. And since the Reformation, there's been an interesting relationship between the churches and the arts, particularly in Northern Europe, the more Protestant end of Europe. The arts have effectively been pushed out of the church initially, which has been good for the arts because it's given them a whole agenda of things to deal with, which hitherto they weren't able to deal with. They were too busy working for the church, as it were. The danger of that, though, and the downside of it has been that art has tended to become a primarily secular world. And very often it's been difficult for Christians who are also artists to function and to do things in a way which seem to have integrity for their work and for their faith. But I think people are beginning to rediscover that, and the churches are part of that rediscovery because they're beginning to see a value again in having Christians who are artists doing their art out in the world, but in a way that is a manifestation of their faith.
Trevor, is it meaningful to describe God as an artist? Is that a helpful way to think about the Christian God?
I think it is. It's one of lots of different ways in which Christians think about God. It has a good root in the Christian scriptures. It's interesting that one of the first pictures the Bible gives of God at all in the early chapters of Genesis is effectively as an artist, because God there takes clay and fashions a human being out of it. And the word used there is that used for potter. And of course, the image of God as a potter or an artist more generally crops up again and again in the Old Testament. It's important, of course, not to take the image of an artist and assume that everything's true about human artists is therefore true about God. It is only a poetic image, but it seems to me to be quite an important one because it communicates some of the things that seem to be important to artists and sees them in the character of God, the sort of care that an artist invests in his or her work, the value that's placed upon it, the skill with which it's undertaken. All those things are invested in that image, I think, and all of them are ascribed to God in the Old Testament and the New Testament.
And taking the sort of raw materials and working them into something that seems, is much greater than the original material.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's right. And it raises interesting questions about creation because very often when we use the word creation as Christians, what Christians mean by that is that there was nothing and then there was something. And sometimes Christians have spoken about that in ways which suggest that the whole thing came into being at once. Now, that's an important truth, but there's another side to it, which is that actually the way God works with creation, according to Christians, is a continuing fashioning. It's as if God's still got his hands very much on that which he's fashioning and is continuing to unfold it, so that creation becomes then a continuous process through the history of the world.
Human creativity and God's creativity, the relationship between those two things, because sometimes we talk about being made in the image of God as somehow reflective of that creative impulse.
Yeah.
Is that helpful?
Yes, I think it is, as long as, again, it's not pushed too far. Yeah. The idea that human beings naturally are makers of things and that reflects in some sense God's own creativity is a central strand of biblical thinking and of Christian thinking. The problem, I think, with speaking of human beings as creative is the related idea that human beings are creators. It's interesting that it's actually the first time the word creator is used of human beings, the Latin term for that, creare, the verb to create. The first time that crops up of human beings rather than of God is at the Renaissance. And it's at that point that the idea of God as an artist suddenly gets fused with the language of creativity, and suddenly you get human artists being invested with the sorts of powers and prerogatives that hitherto have only been ascribed to God. So suddenly human beings are understood to have this almost divine significance, able to take something and fashion something radically new out of it. And while there's a glimpse of truth in there, there's also huge danger. And of course, some of what came out of that was ultimately manifested in damaging ways of dealing with the environment, where human beings felt the world was theirs to plunder, and they had the power and the right to do so because, like God, they were creators. That, I think, needs to be handled extremely carefully for obvious reasons.
If you've just joined us, you're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. We're featuring today an interview I did with Trevor Hart, a theologian who's talking about the relationship between art and faith. It's a very positive idea, isn't it? A very attractive idea that, if it's true, that we can participate in something that is an ongoing act of God. And what does it say to us about this impulse to create? Are we missing out on something if we don't engage in that sort of creative work? Or can we just be appreciators of other people's creative work?
In one sense, we can simply appreciate others' work, but I think we are creative in all sorts of ways, perhaps that we wouldn't identify as being creative. It seems to me that simply in the ways we live our lives sometimes, we find new ways of doing things, or we get gratification out of an opportunity to do something new. And I think when human beings become frustrated and begin to be uncomfortable in life, very often is when they're locked in to patterns of doing the same thing all the time exactly the same way. Now, for many of us, work demands that there's a sense in which we do that day to day. And very often people will say the most enjoyable and satisfying work they do is when they have the freedom to be somewhat creative. But it doesn't have to be in work, it can be outside work. And I do think there's a problem when people live lives where they have no opportunities and they aren't provided with opportunities to express this need to take and make more of what they're given in life than they already have. And that can be through leisure activities, it can be through participation in the arts, it can be all sorts of things.
You're a Christian theologian, but I imagine you can see elements of God's truth in what you might call secular art and performance and so on.
Yes. This is something which I find quite challenging, and I also find quite important to try and communicate to people that if an artist is a great artist, and if they are engaging truthfully with the world, showing the world as they see it, and breaking open out of it meaning which is there to be broken out, then I think that's every bit as important for Christians to consider and look at and say, I can learn from that, as anything that goes on under the label of Christian art, or art that is done by Christians. I think God's Spirit works in all sorts of ways outside the church, for which, frankly, we have a lot to be thankful. That's true in the arts, it's true in the sciences, it's true in all sorts of walks of life, that truth is God's truth, and where people are actually engaging with it helpfully and healthily and opening up that truth for human benefit, for human enjoyment, for human consideration, then I think we have to acknowledge God's Spirit at work in that. Whatever else we might want to say, we have to say that much. And so artists who are not Christians but who are out there doing their thing and which communicate profound meaning to me when I see their work or listen to their work, I can give thanks to God for that.
Does art in some way point us towards this sort of non-material aspect of life and the transcendent maybe, and maybe even towards God? Yeah. And is that therefore a kind of connecting point for believers and those who are just great appreciators of art?
I think it might be. I think art is one of those things that in a radically non-religious view of the world, shall we say, is one of those things that crop up as a bit of an anomaly and difficult to make sense of. Because art is so shot through with the sense that there has to be more than this than meets the eye. There just has to be. And if that's true of art, and most people will acknowledge that it is true of art, then it raises the question, well, might that not also be true of other things? Or are the values and the meanings, the significances with which we invest art or which we find in art, are they simply things which we project onto it? I think that's the challenging question. But I suspect most people approaching that without the desire to find a particular answer to the question will acknowledge that they discern something more there. They're not conscious of putting it there. It speaks to them, it draws them out of themselves. So it does point, it's a sort of signal that there's more there than first meets the eye, or the hand, or whatever sense it is that we're appealing to in art.
It seems to me like perhaps you and I could go and hear a symphony, for instance, and there's something going on there, but it will affect us in profoundly different ways depending on what's going on for us. There's something, kind of a third element to all of this, isn't there, that again is part of what you're talking about?
Yes, and part of it's what we bring to it. I can remember an occasion where I visited a cathedral with a friend who wasn't a Christian, and we sat there in the wooden pews right at the back and gazed around at this amazing architecture. And the person next to me was, I think, appreciating it on all sorts of levels. But I could just sense that I was appreciating it on a completely different level because of what I brought to it, which was my Christian faith and the sense that there was something here which spoke to me of the grandeur of God and all the rest. Now, the question is that there in the building, or is it something I simply bring to it? There's no doubt it's something I do bring to it, but I think it has to be both. I think there's something there, but you need the eyes to see and the ears to hear. You need to speak the language. And for someone with no faith, obviously there's a different set of things going on. They may be interesting and important, but they won't get the same encounter. And I think that's true of the arts too. Sometimes art initially, when it emerges on the scene, new sorts of art, has a really hard time making any headway, or it gets rejected, sometimes violently, like Stravinsky's First Night of the Rite of Spring and so on, where there were riots in the theatre. That's because sometimes great art needs to teach people the language that they need in order to appreciate it and to hear it speaking to them. So there's a complex set of things going on here. It's not simply a matter of there is meaning there and it is, as it were, downloaded as we approach the object. There's much more going on, but there is something there, and that it can be learned and appreciated, and that it does speak, seems to me to be far too broad a matter of human testimony to be gainsayable.
Well, that was Professor Trevor Hart, who was in Sydney this year to give the New College Lectures. If you'd like to listen to those lectures, they're available online. Search New College Lectures. We'll see you next time on Life and Faith.